Welcome to Gospel Perspectives on World History, and I'm your host, Michael Stone. Thank you for joining us as we continue looking at the secular history of the world through the lens of the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. While this podcast is primarily geared towards members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, anyone who has an interest in topics of faith and history are welcome to join us. And as an important legal notice, while I do intend to center what I share as much as possible on the verified details of the historical record and on ancient and modern scripture approved by the Church, I do want to stress that the views I share here do not necessarily represent official doctrine, policy, or the views of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and that I take full responsibility for the content and programming of this podcast. So, with that having been said, we are now moving forward to a new area in our podcast, to the Mediterranean Sea, where we'll learn about the earliest beginnings of our written language, the bizarrely wild true story behind the myth of the Minotaur, as well as the actual history of one of the most well-known and misremembered wars you'll ever find in a textbook. So, we will dial back a little bit in time to 2000 BC. On the island of Crete, it's just southeast of Greece, you have a civilization beginning to form. Coming into its height around 1600 BC, around the time of Joseph of Egypt, the Minoan civilization maintained a robust trading network among the islands and ports of the Aegean Sea. There is evidence to suggest that they maintained a dominance over these other groups as well by forcing the other cultures to offer them tribute. The name Minoan comes from the mythical name of King Minos, who in Greek myth had a massive labyrinth, in the middle of which he kept this huge half-man, half-bull monster, appropriately named the Minotaur. And according to this legend, King Minos would capture young Greek youth and then trap them in his labyrinth, only to have them be hunted down by the Minotaur in the maze. You can see here how even the myths of a people can contain important hints about the historical truths of their cultures. Greeks would not be the first or last peoples to cultivate their resentment of their ancient enemies like the Minoans into these enduring stories. I mean, just consider the Lamanites, for example, who passed down their traditions of the injustice Laman and Lemuel falsely claimed was done to them by their upstart young brother. But while we can safely say there never was a Minotaur, the Greek memory of the labyrinths and bulls was not entirely false. The ruins of Knossos, the palace complex at Crete, definitely give a very maze-like appearance if you ever do a Google image search of that. A stunning number of weapons from those ruins are double-headed axes as well. The Greek word for which was labyrinx, the word root for labyrinth, incidentally. And there are a lot of frescoes, mosaics, pottery, and other art featuring bulls in Minoan artifacts. The most fascinating of these finds depicts an athletic event involving these bulls that deserves closer attention. Using corroborating evidence from a number of sources, historians are confident that the ancient Minoans revered the bull as a sacred animal, representing their chief deity. And in their rites surrounding this animal, they would even have a kind of a bull fight, for the lack of a better term. Though I highly doubt any matador we might be familiar with would ever consider doing anything near as dangerous as the Minoan style of bull fighting. From the records left to us, it appears that young men and women selected to participate in this ritual with a given bull would first seek to get it angry, which I would not recommend you do generally. And they would get the bull to charge directly at them. and they would stay still, allowing the bull to just get within arm's reach. And then they grab the bull by the horns, and while holding them, leap from the ground and then propel themselves backwards over the back of the bull in what must have been a stunning forward flip. All, of course, without any protective armor or clothing whatsoever. So, yeah, that's the Minoan style of bullfighting. Definitely does put a different spin on the phrase taking the bull by the horns, doesn't it? Contrary to what I would probably guess, their civilization did not die out pursuing wild thrills like this. Instead, shortly after reaching their height of power around 1600 BC, their civilization just disappears from the archaeological record. One likely culprit of this is the cataclysmic eruption of the volcano Etna on the island of Santorini, part of the Minoan domain. Unlike the similarly fated Roman Isle of Pompeii, however, there was not even an island left after the Titanic explosion. Where there once was an island, there now is just only a broken caldera, a ring of rocks in a now otherwise a lifeless sea. The tidal waves, this kind of supermassive eruption it must have generated, would likely have devastated any ancient Minoan fleets, crippling their power and finally giving their subjugated nations a chance to strike back and bring down the oppressive Minoan regime. The Minoans, of course, were not the only ones to have so quickly vanished from history, as we know. Besides the many secular examples we could cite, I will actually mention an example from the Book of Mormon, which has several examples that we could pick from. The one that I'll focus on, though, is the people of the city of Ammonihah, who we read were studying to overthrow the freedom of the Nephites and who mocked Alma and Amulek's warnings that a people as powerful and as mighty as the Ammonihahites could, in a single day, be utterly destroyed. And after burning converts to the church along with their scriptures, and after being given every possible chance to repent, the Lord allowed the Lamanites to do just that and to obliterate the city, leaving behind a broken pile of rubble and corpses that came to be known as the desolation of the Nehors, in remembrance of the apostate doctrines they followed. So, a powerful reminder to us today that as vaunted or as indomitable as any nation might seem, history can be fickle. Fortunes can change on a dime. And some claim that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints today is alarmist. When we warn that the disintegration of the family will bring about the prophesied calamities foretold by ancient and modern prophets. But then again, such critics would not be the first in history to ignore what ultimately turns out to be a genuine danger. The Minoans probably didn't have prophets, seers, and revelators to warn them of Mount Etna. How foolish we will look to them if we're going to be the ones who also decide to, like the Ammonihahites, stubbornly dismiss prophetic warnings. In the wake of the Minoan disaster, three other groups begin to come to the forefront of the Mediterranean stage. And we'll go into detail with two of them, I think, in this episode. The first will cover the Mycenaeans, named so because of their largest city was called Mycenae. And these guys are of a particular interest. They're going to become the primary forebearers of the ancient Greeks, Like the Minoans before them, the Mycenaeans were a seafaring people, but unlike the Minoans, they existed as several separate yet loosely united kingdoms. Cities like Thebes, Sparta, and Pylos were also part of this culture, and also happen to be the same kingdoms that are mentioned in the Iliad, the story of the Trojan War. This, of course, begs a question. Was Troy real? Was there a real Trojan War with a horse and everything? Actually, we have found the ruins of a city very much like the one described in Homer's epic poem of the war. What is fascinating about those ruins is that while we still haven't found the wooden horse, we have discovered that Troy was not just destroyed once, but several times. It was destroyed and rebuilt several times, with the newer iterations of the city being built right on top of the ruins of the old. All in all, there are about 4,000 years of history of people living in this city of Troy. And we just do not know much about it. It's a story we may not fully learn about until Christ comes again and reveals all things. That there was a conflict between the Mycenaeans, or the Proto-Greeks, if you want to think of them that way, and the Trojans, at least is, in my opinion, very likely. There was a Trojan War of some sort. After all, the place was eventually settled by Greeks, and the original Trojans did not bear the same cultural trappings of the Greeks. A conquest of some sort must have taken place at some point. Though I think it's important to point out that the question of whether or not the Trojan War being real it sidesteps the significance of the myth of the Trojan War itself. The stories that a people decides to tell and to retell, the legends they choose to emphasize and to celebrate, can often tell us more about these ancient peoples than perhaps they could have supposed. And while I don't intend to retell the full story of their war here, I highly recommend reading it for yourself. Some key details of the story can help us learn about what the Greeks and what they remember the Mycenaeans were of value to their cultures. First of all, there's how the Trojan War started in the myth. The myth goes on to say that the gods on Olympus were having a party and decided to pull a King Stephen from Sleeping Beauty move by not inviting Eris, the goddess of chaos, to the party. Understandable, perhaps, but because of this slight, she decides to get her hands on a rare golden apple, and on it inscribes the words, "To the fairest," and then goes up to the party's doorway and tosses the fruit inside. 3 of the Greek goddesses immediately catch sight of it and quickly get into a fight over who should have the apple. Hera, the wife of Zeus and the goddess of marriage, Athena, goddess of wisdom, and Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty. Zeus was initially asked to judge between them who is the most fair so that they could decide who gets the apple, but he, for once, was wise and decided not to raise anyone's temper, namely Hera's, and instead sent them away to have some random mortal judge them instead. The 3 deities approach Paris, a young Trojan prince, and compel him to judge. Each offers him a bribe, of course, in this competition. Hera offers Paris power unparalleled. Athena offers him all the wisdom of the world, and Aphrodite offers Paris the most beautiful woman in the world. It probably reveals why Homer doesn't really depict Paris too flatteringly in his story when we learn that Paris ultimately chooses Aphrodite's offer. The catch to Aphrodite's offer is that the most beautiful mortal woman, Helen, is currently married to the king of Mycenae. His goddess-assisted enchantment of Helen and their subsequent elopement to Troy ignites a war between Mycenae and Troy, which lasts for 10 years and constitutes the majority of the story of the Iliad, or at least, the Iliad goes over some of the last bits of that war, though it's mentioned in there that it goes for 10 years. Anyway, highly recommend reading the poem for yourself to get the full story. The narrative, it does highlight one disturbing trend, however, that I want to point out, that we see in a number of cultures. And it also bears resemblance to another Greek myth of Pandora's box. Because you see, in that myth as well, a woman is blamed for unleashing a catastrophe. And likewise, many Christians today believe that Eve is similarly at fault for the fallen state of humanity. That her decision to partake of the fruit was a needless, stupid tragedy. We are grateful for latter-day revelation, however, which clarifies that Eve was not a sinister or gullible figure, but rather a wise, forward-thinking woman who knew that she and Adam could not progress and become more than who they were if they remained in the garden. She willingly chose adversity, even if she didn't fully understand the concept. Contrary to the devil's plan to destroy God's plan for humanity, Eve's decision did not throw a wrench in the works. It was anticipated. It was planned for. And the adversary may well have thought at the time that he was pulling a fast one on God, but of course only a being with his ego and narcissism would have the capacity to assume that. In the end, God, by doing what he did, preserved Adam's and Eve's freedom to choose to partake of the fruit or not, while also providing a savior for them to help them overcome the physical and spiritual death that would inevitably follow. Woman, in this case, was not the unwitting pawn of evil and chaos, but in every respect a leader, the courageous mother of all, of whom we should be proud and not ashamed. Unfortunately, in the case of the ancient Greeks and Mycenaeans, their sincere beliefs about Pandora, Helen, and thus women in general led them to believe that women were not to be trusted with important decisions, that they should be therefore shut out of public life entirely. We'll speak more of this in future episodes as we get into classical Greece, but for now it suffices us to point out the origins of these unfortunate backward attitudes. The Mycenaeans will ultimately fall victim to the same late Bronze Age collapse that claimed the Hittites in the 12th century before Christ. Their fall during the region-wide series of invasions, natural disasters, and mass migrations usher in a period where technology and culture fell in on itself, ushering in the Greek Dark Ages that would take the peninsula centuries to recover from. After this late Bronze Age collapse, we see the rise of the Phoenicians. These seafarers were based just north of Israel, inhabiting cities mentioned in the Bible like Tyre and Sidon. They came to spread several colonies all around the Mediterranean, becoming proficient traders with groups even as far as the West African coast. Part of their success was due to the high demand for their unique purple dye, a color extremely hard to obtain for clothing and other materials. One of the only places to get this dye was from the Phoenicians, who sourced it from a specific species of snail that grew only in their own home territory. This is partly why throughout the ancient world, purple came to be such an expensive color to obtain, and then therefore associated only with those of noble birth. This is why even today we associate the color purple with royalty. Of much more importance than purple dye, however, was the fact that in order for anyone to gain access to this wide Phoenician network of markets all across the Mediterranean, they would need to learn to read, speak, and write Phoenician. The Phoenician alphabet itself was derived from the Minoan and Mycenaean alphabets, which were sometimes called Linear A and Linear B. The Phoenician iteration of these characters became so widespread in its usage that other nations incorporated those same characters into their own alphabets. The Greeks, notably, were influenced by this alphabet, who then in turn had their alphabet borrowed and adapted by the Etruscans, who came to found the city of Rome. The alphabet I am using to write these episodes for this podcast right now, the alphabet you see on whatever screen or device is streaming this podcast right now, is that same Roman alphabet. Perhaps now you can understand why when we talk about teaching children to learn to read, we discuss phonics. Or to spell something as it sounds, we may ask that someone spell it phonetically. So if you'll allow me a little dark humor, just remember that if you speak English or use any of the many other languages that use the Roman alphabet, every time you send a text, every time you read a book, every time you read a comment or post for the internet, you can thank millions and millions of ancient, dead, mashed up snails from a little place called Phoenicia. And that concludes our episode for today. Tune in next time as we begin exploring the foundations of classical Greece, which in turn begin to shape much of Western thought and philosophy for generations to come. Also, if you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to leave us a review. And if you know others who'd enjoy this series, please consider sharing it with them. One easy way to do that is you can use the link in the episode description for our show's website, and you can share that on your ward's social media page so that other members of the church can enjoy the show as well. I would like to thank everyone who supported the launch of this podcast, including my lovely wife, my kids, and my loving brother-in-law Spencer for suggesting I go through with this idea. And again, thank you for listening, and stay safe out there.